Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Royalty Now, where we bring you face to face with figures from the past and talk about their history. Today, we're talking about Catherine the Great, a minor princess from the Holy Roman Empire with a grand vision, who overthrew her own husband to become Russia's longest reigning female monarch. We'll talk about her fascinating history and then discuss her portraits and what she looked like before revealing our facial recreations at the end. So let's go ahead and get started. Sophie Augusta von Anhalt-Zerbst-Dornberg was born on the 2nd of May, 1729, in the Kingdom of Prussia, to her mother, Joanna, and her father, Christian August. Although her father, Christian, was part of the German ruling family of Anhalt, he was a minor relative, and the family had to live off Christian's modest military pay. This matter caused Catherine's mother, Joanna, a lot of embarrassment, as she had been raised in one of Germany's most luxurious courts, which was full of balls, hunts, and theater plays. Not to mention that she had married Christian when she was 15 and he was 37, fully expecting a lavish life. For Joanna, this embarrassment led to a lot of jealousy. Her brother would go on to become the King of Sweden, while she was stuck with the other end of the stick. When she got pregnant for the first time, Joanna hoped that she would give birth to only sons, so that she could reclaim some of her lost pride by raising a great ruler. But when Catherine was born, Joanna was disappointed to find out that she was a girl, and a rough recovery from labor led to Catherine being generally taken care of by her servants, with little affection from her mother. Raised in a small house in a military town, even Catherine herself says that her early childhood was pretty uneventful. It wasn't until Catherine was around 6 that her mother finally seemed to realize that having a boy wasn't the only way for her to move up in the world. She looked at her pretty young daughter and realized that a powerful match could be made. At this time, the Holy Roman Empire was broken up into 300 completely sovereign entities, meaning there were lots and lots of families vying for attention and power. If Catherine was going to be noticed, she would have to become exceptional. From then on, Catherine was held to extremely high standards by her mother, and was reminded day after day that her entire life's purpose was to become the obedient and dutiful wife to a powerful man, an idea that even a young Catherine resented. She would later state that she really considered herself a tomboy. Instead of playing dress-up and dreaming of marrying a charming prince, she instead liked playing rough, and even took up training with swords, which she was said to have been very good with. Even though Catherine didn't like being stuck indoors during her schooling, she realized that she was actually rather good at it. She quickly became fluent in French and found the etiquette and conversation of it all pretty natural. By the time she was 8, she was considered proper and cultured enough for her mother to begin forcing her to travel around Europe, to be paraded under the eyes of powerful noblemen. When they would finally arrive to their destination, Joanna would zealously show off her daughter to nearly any family of means. But this same eagerness rubbed many the wrong way, and gossip began to spread about the tacky and power-hungry way that Joanna handled her daughter. Catherine would later reflect on her childhood, stating that she felt more like a product to be sold than a child. When things didn't go her mother's way, she would quickly lose her temper with Catherine and often got violent. In 1740, Catherine was dragged to yet another city. Joanna had heard some interesting news from her brother in Sweden and decided that she and Catherine would go pay him a visit. Joanna's brother, Adolf Frederick, had become the guardian of a 12-year-old orphan named Karl Peter Ulrich. Karl was the last living grandchild of Peter the Great, Russia's first emperor. And if things went a certain way, Karl seemed to have a very legitimate claim to the Russian throne. This opportunity was intoxicating to Joanna and simply too good to miss. When they arrived, Joanna made sure that Karl and Catherine spent lots of time together, and to her eyes it was love at first sight. In reality, Catherine stated that she immediately found Karl repulsive, saying she disliked how pale he was and that already, at the age of 12, had a fondness for alcohol. Although they didn't know it then, this meeting would change the course of both of their lives. To the east, in Russia, Karl's aunt Elizabeth had garnered enough support to overthrow her cousin, Ivan VI, and make herself the Empress of Russia. Empress Elizabeth is an important part of this story because she was almost the blueprint for what Catherine would later become. Elizabeth was Peter the Great's favorite daughter. She was a beautiful and brilliant woman, but she was constantly overlooked her whole life. Although not formally educated, she became fluent in Italian, German, and French, and loved not only the typical feminine things like dancing and court intrigue, but also hunting and horse riding. Unfortunately for Elizabeth, these same qualities seemed to intimidate most marriage prospects. She had been engaged only once to Joanna's eldest brother, Charles, who tragically died just before their wedding, but it was said that she honored his memory her entire life. Joanna could not believe her luck. She quickly wrote a letter congratulating Elizabeth on becoming empress and reminiscing over her deceased older brother. A few months later, when Joanna gave birth to a baby girl, she sent the Empress another letter asking to be allowed to name her Elizabeth. Attached with this letter was a portrait of her eldest daughter, Catherine, who was now a young woman of 15. Although a little tacky, this tactic did work, and Elizabeth was said to have been pleased by Catherine's beauty. The Empress had been looking for a marriage partner for her heir, who, since she had no children of her own, turned out to be her nephew, Karl Ulrich. In 1744, Joanna received a letter ordering her to come to Russia with her daughter immediately. Without a moment's hesitation, she began packing. But just as they were set to leave, another letter reached Joanna. Joanna, Christian, and Catherine were asked to go to Berlin. When they arrived, the King of Prussia met with them alone and asked Joanna to become a spy for Prussia. Joanna was never one to turn down a bit of intrigue and excitement, and she was delighted by the attention that she was getting from such an important man. She enthusiastically accepted his offer. Catherine and her mother would travel the long way from Berlin to Moscow, and during the notoriously brutal winters of Russia. They finally arrived after a month on the road. But for Catherine, the weather had not been the worst part of the trip. Her relationship with her mother was as strained as ever, and it seemed that somewhere along the way, Catherine had decided that she would do anything she could to finally escape her mother's grasp. This resolve was only strengthened when she met Empress Elizabeth. In her, she saw a woman she actually admired, a strong woman, confident, intelligent, and totally herself, polar opposite of Joanna. From the start, Catherine spared no effort trying to charm the Empress and the Russian court. She was soon taking lessons to learn the Russian language, which she didn't really have to do since everyone already spoke French. But she wanted to learn more about this empire, with its foreign and interesting traditions, and emulate her aunt. So she stayed up late, repeating the language to herself over and over. Unfortunately, just as she was starting to settle in, Catherine fell ill with pneumonia. For weeks, it got worse and worse, getting to the point where Joanna didn't believe Catherine would even survive. Joanna even elected to bring in a Lutheran pastor to give her daughter her final rites, pretty much leaving Catherine's fate to God. This decision enraged Empress Elizabeth, who knew that Catherine needed care, and that her life could still be saved. For the first time, Elizabeth saw just how cold Joanna was to her daughter. In her feverish state, Catherine later wrote in her memoirs that she decided then and there that she would do whatever it took to wear the Russian crown. Catherine suddenly woke up from her delirium and told her mother, "I don't want any Lutheran. I want my Orthodox father," plainly and purposefully choosing the Russian norm over her family's faith. This moment made her very popular in the Russian court, and it charmed Empress Elizabeth. From then on, the Empress would treat Catherine as if she were her own daughter. Under the Empress's doting care, Catherine did eventually recover. However, it became clear that her mother had vastly overstayed her welcome. She was not only overbearing, critical, and always complaining, But Joanna's spying for the King of Prussia had been uncovered. Instead of understandably flying into a blind rage and expelling Joanna from court, the Empress Elizabeth instead informed Joanna that she could stay, but only until her daughter and her heir, Karl Ulrich, were married. Catherine had been chosen to become the next Empress Consort of Russia. On the 21st of August, 1745, Catherine married Karl Ulrich, who had adopted the name of Peter. She would officially join the Russian Church, and carefully chose to adopt the name of Russia's first female ruler, Catherine I. Catherine's mother would leave the day after the wedding without even saying goodbye. The two would never see each other again. For the first time, Catherine's life was her own, and it was the beginning of a new chapter. There was just one problem: her husband. Peter's personality was almost like a parody of what you think a rich and entitled person would be like. He was rude, he was selfish, he was ignorant, and he just did not care. The 12-year-old that she had met so long ago had grown only physically, leaving his immaturity completely intact. In her memoirs, Catherine would describe him as an idiot, a drunkard, and stated that there was nothing worse than having a child husband. When they moved in together, it was painfully obvious that the two were not compatible. Soon enough, Peter took a mistress, and eventually Catherine did the same. Although at first she took lovers just to make Peter jealous, eventually she became involved with men that she actually liked, who were completely different from her husband, intelligent and progressive men, who introduced her to the works of Voltaire, the French Enlightenment, even the Roman historian Tacitus. These intellectuals completely blew Catherine away and caused a shift in her teenage mind. Why should she settle for being a consort? Her idiot husband Peter would undoubtedly waste any opportunities he had as emperor. She would not. As time went on, Catherine and Peter only grew further and further apart, and Catherine eventually moved out into her own home. 10 years would pass, and Catherine would later reveal that they had never even consummated their marriage. But in early 1754, Empress Elizabeth had had enough, and would demand that the two get along just long enough to give her an heir. If they did not, she would have to pick someone else to rule Russia after her death, something that Catherine could not let happen. Almost exactly 9 months later, on September 20th, 1754, Catherine gave birth to a baby boy named Paul. Almost immediately after his birth, he was taken from Catherine and given to the Empress Elizabeth, who would raise Paul for the rest of her life. Although we don't know for sure, Elizabeth taking Paul is thought to have been an attempt to legitimize him to the Russian court. In the first version of her memoirs, written decades later, Catherine strongly implied that Paul wasn't actually Peter's son. However, amended versions later show a changed story. Whether or not it was Peter's son, Catherine seemed okay leaving him in the care of the Empress. After his birth, Catherine was free to stop pretending to be a couple with Peter. In 1760, she began seeing a man who truly changed things, named Grigory Orlov, a quick-witted, empathetic military officer who would help turn Catherine's lofty ideas for Russia into actions. In 1762, Empress Elizabeth died at the age of 52, with Catherine by her side. During her reign, she had pointed her country towards the future, bringing Russia to the precipice of a golden age. But Catherine knew, more than anyone, that if allowed, her imbecile husband Peter would be the end of that progress. She was quickly proven correct, when not long after becoming Tsar, Peter immediately seemed to side with the Prussian King Frederick II, who was his idol. This move was very awkward for the Russian people since they were literally in a war with Prussia, and had been for the last 6 years. Peter pretty much bent the knee to King Frederick, accepting nearly all of his terms to the end of the war, even suggesting a joint war against Denmark, a longtime ally of Russia's. These tone-deaf and idiotic decisions were often made drunk, and it wasn't long before Peter had alienated nearly everyone who had initially supported him. Behind the scenes, Catherine and her lover Orlov had hatched a plan to overthrow Peter. This was supported by Peter's disgruntled guards, and the Russian priests, who feared that Peter may turn the country Lutheran just to impress Prussia. When Peter caught wind of her plans, Catherine realized that it was now or never. On July 9, 1762, Catherine arrived at the Oranienbaum Palace, surrounded by the king's guards, and ordered the arrest of her husband. She forced Peter to sign a letter of abdication, leaving the crown to Catherine. News of Catherine's coup sent shockwaves through Europe, and the Prussian king, Peter's idol, would even go on to say that Peter had allowed himself to be dethroned like a child sent off to bed. Unfortunately, no matter what, Catherine knew that Peter was always going to be a thorn in her side. On July 17th, 8 days after the coup, Peter III died of unknown causes. At 33 years old, Catherine, the daughter of minor nobility, became the Empress of Russia. Now that no one was left in her way, she could truly become the ruler she wanted to be. From the very beginning, Catherine saw herself not just as a ruler, but as a reformer. She wanted to pull Russia out of its old medieval traditions and into the modern world. But reshaping a nation the size of a continent would take more than just courage. It would take true vision. She began to extensively read books to learn about the world around her empire. She wrote letters to some of the leading minds in Europe, scientists, economists, and philosophers, all in an effort to find Russia's best way forward into the new world. At court, Catherine introduced these ideas to others, bringing in architects, painters, and scientists, all who believed deeply in Enlightenment thinking, freedom of speech, the separation of church and state, and science. These beliefs led her to implement many policies that improved the lives of countless everyday Russians. She set up foundling homes for children that had been abandoned. And when faced with a smallpox epidemic, Catherine bravely chose to have herself inoculated first, so that she could show the people of Russia that science and medicine were nothing to be scared of. Her grandest idea was a project called the Nakaz, meaning instruction, which was a sweeping legal document that laid out a grand vision for justice in Russia. It called for equality before the law, the elimination of torture, and a government rooted in reason, not privilege. Unfortunately, this new system would hurt the nobility of Russia. So although she spent years trying, the Russian nobility were eventually able to obstruct the document from ever truly being put into law. Yet even in defeat, Catherine always knew how to make a statement. She published her Nakaz and let it spread, shocking and impressing the courts around Europe. Her message was clear. Russia was no longer the dark, cold frontier of Europe. Under Catherine, it was becoming a modern state with a mind of its own. Although Catherine seemed to always be working tirelessly for her country, that didn't mean that she didn't make time for herself. In fact, Catherine had 12 known lovers over the course of her life, each one younger than the last. And they weren't just romantic partners, they were friends. Many were advisors, supporters, and even tutors for her son. Throughout Catherine's life, her enemies tried to paint her as immoral, even monstrous, spreading some pretty crazy rumors that were clearly based in misogyny. But Catherine didn't care. She was the ruler of an empire. Her heart and her bed were her own business. The only thing the Empress truly seemed to struggle with in her life was her relationship with her son, Paul. Since Empress Elizabeth had raised Paul without much input from Catherine, they had never become close. He grew up bitter, awkward, and paranoid, much more like his father than Catherine would ever want to admit. Maybe because of these similarities, Catherine never fully allowed herself to trust him with power. And by the end of her life, she was already making plans to bypass him and crown her grandson Alexander instead. But before she could fix this last piece of the puzzle into her legacy, death arrived at her door. On November 17, 1796, Catherine suffered a stroke in her palace and died hours later. She was 67 years old. She left behind one of the most remarkable legacies in history, a minor German princess who became the longest reigning female ruler of Russia. Under her reign, Russia had expanded, modernized, and become a cultural force in Europe. She helped bring in the Age of Enlightenment and laid the groundwork for imperial splendor that would define Russia for another century. In life, she was a woman who reshaped her world, refusing to be shaped by it. In death, she became something rarer still, a ruler worthy of the title they would give her, Catherine the Great. So, what did Catherine the Great really look like? We have many stunning portraits of Catherine, from the time she was very young until nearly the end of her life. But you have to be careful when looking for portraits of the Empress that you're looking at an original. There are only a few portraits that were made from life, and the rest are copies of these originals. You'll see her portraits organized into types, collections of copies in the same pose that vary slightly in features. One of these types, the Rokotov type, was Catherine's favorite. Stemming from an original coronation portrait by Fedor Rokotov, Catherine loved her Roman profile. She called this portrait her favorite because it resembled the Roman coins of antiquity. She was reigning during the time that images of not just a powerful, but also an enlightened monarch were becoming popular. It was important to show not just grandeur, but intelligence and sophistication as well, which was accomplished with the profile view. I also love this state portrait of Catherine painted from life in her mid-30s, which I've used for her recreation. Catherine was a very short woman, only about 5 feet tall, with natural dark hair and bright blue eyes. While she wasn't considered particularly beautiful, she was considered very attractive, with her intelligence, passion, and charm. She was often really low-key in real life outside of her portraits, preferring simple clothing and hair. I love that she always looks confident, happy, and even slightly amused in her portraits, since most royal portraits look somewhere between neutral and miserable. I find her just a very likable character. For Catherine's recreation, I've shown her with her natural dark hair. So let's take a look at the face of Catherine the Great now.